Thanks for joining us today. I'm Cody Holyoke. Our special Commitment 2024 coverage continues today with an in-depth look at the race for Attorney General in Missouri. This week, we'll hear from all three candidates running for the job. Civil rights attorney Elad Gross, the Democratic challenger, is running against current AG Andrew Bailey, who was appointed to the post and wants to be elected to a full term. We'll also hear from attorney Ryan Monroe, but we'll start with Mr. Gross.
We need someone who's going to make sure that when you have a problem in your community, that person has your back.
He's been in the race before, losing a battle in the primaries for the position in 2020. Elad Gross is from St. Louis, where he practices as a civil rights attorney. He studied law at Washington University in St. Louis and served in the AG's office before as an assistant attorney general when Chris Koster had the job. Gross is making the pitch to voters that major change is needed in the AG's office. That's where we start our conversation today. Over the course of the campaign, you have said that the system is broken in Jeff City. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of systems that are broken overall here in Missouri right now. I don't think our government is doing a very good job representing the people of the state of Missouri. And I think that you see a whole lot of issues around corruption, where our taxpayer money is going. I think a lot of that is centered in Jefferson City right now, which is one reason why I think we need a watchdog as our Attorney General.
As an assistant attorney general, you were kind of part of that system, at least up until 8 years or so ago. How would you make this better?
Yeah, so I mean, as the assistant attorneys general, we aren't elected, right? That's a position that you have, so you're there, and really you're doing a whole lot of work on behalf of the people as the attorneys who are doing the bulk of the work for that office. So when I was there, we had about 200 or so attorneys who were working there. A lot fewer right now. I think one of the big problems that we see at the Attorney General's office is a lack of staffing and poor management, honestly, which is a reason why we're not seeing a lot of the same services we used to receive then. But I've definitely proposed some reforms even from the time when I was there. I think we need a public corruption unit at the Attorney General's office focused on making sure taxpayer money goes where it's supposed to. I think we need a civil rights division to prevent government abuses of all of our civil liberties. I think that we need to go after puppy mills quite a bit more. We need to go after scam callers. My focus would be on the people of the state of Missouri. We are dealing with so many problems here. I mean, look at just the costs of living right now in Missouri when you're talking about rent that's going up for a lot of folks, the cost of food that's going up. We have captured markets where these huge corporations, especially in rural Missouri right now, are the only gig in town, like a Dollar General or something else. And we're seeing price gouging in some of those stores too. I think that we need a real focus on the issues that are affecting Missourians. And unfortunately, a lot of Missourians don't even know who our Attorney General is right now. And it is a big red flag if you don't know the name of your attorney or what your attorney is doing for you. So now I would certainly be focused on solving Missouri problems with Missouri money.
What's the biggest Missouri problem?
Oh, man. Well, you know, the number one complaint that comes to that office every single year are scam calls. And we have record numbers of amounts of money that is being scammed away from seniors, especially right now. But there's a whole lot of issues. I mean, we're not dealing with drinking water problems right now. We're seeing a lot of environmental conservation impacts. But I think the basic fundamental issue is we do not have a government that is working for the people of Missouri. And so that's why I think a public corruption unit is so important at that office.
We've talked a lot about public corruption in the news, especially, and gun violence as well.
Yes.
In Kansas City, St. Louis, but across the state. Centered more on urban areas just because of the larger population.
Right.
How would you tackle that as Attorney General?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm the only one who's got a comprehensive plan to deal with gun violence generally in Missouri. And it doesn't require a whole bunch of new laws or the legislature to get their act together on any of these things. Right now, in states and areas really all around the world that have dealt with violence and reduced it have done two things. One is you make sure that folks who are committing violent crime are being prosecuted, and the Attorney General's office can work with prosecutors' offices, including in Kansas City, in St. Louis, and Cape Girardeau right now too, Springfield, to make sure that they have the resources they need. Folks have expectations, and when you do something like that, folks know that you will be punished for it. We have to remove those folks from the streets to keep everyone safe. But the other side of that is, once someone is shot or killed, you're not bringing that person back. You have a broken community as a result of that, and we need to do as much as we can to prevent violence from happening in the first place, and that requires significant investment in our communities, and the Attorney General should be the coordinating mechanism for this in our state. So I have a pretty detailed plan on that issue.
It is hard to separate gun owners from the gun violence issue, especially because they think that the government might be trying to take their guns away. How do you walk that line as Attorney General?
I've got guns. I don't need to take yours away. All right. So that's not what the deal is here. It's not about violating people's Second Amendment rights. It's about making sure that folks, especially folks who should not have guns, aren't able to get them. And a lot of folks are. I mean, I've worked with kids for a long time. I know 14-year-olds who are able to buy guns on the street. That should not be happening in Missouri. And because we're not tackling those guns that are illegally possessed or illegally being transferred, we're not dealing with that issue at all. And most of violent crime in Missouri and elsewhere is committed by very few people. And if we're not targeting, if we're not making sure that we're dealing with this issue the way that everywhere else is done with it, and done it in a successful way, I don't know what the heck we're doing here in Missouri. So there's a lot of smart policies on that issue for sure.
I do want to ask you about one of the ballot initiatives that's on the ballot, and that is Amendment 3, which would reverse, if passed, the state's near total abortion ban. There are bound to be challenges post November 5th. That's just kind of the nature of this issue in Missouri.
Correct.
What would you do as Attorney General to protect the will of the people if this is approved?
I will defend it. And that's what is so important for folks to understand. Amendment 3 is going to put reproductive freedom into the state constitution. What it's going to do is it's going to say government, big government cannot get involved in family issues to the degree that it is right now, right? And that's going to be up to a judge and courts, a lot of challenges. But we need an attorney general who's going to defend that right. And right now, we've got an attorney general who has done everything under the sun to try to thwart what the people want to do, including trying to stop people in Missouri from voting and accessing our constitutional right to put issues on the ballot. And I think that's totally wrong. That is not the role of the Attorney General. Whether you agree or disagree with issues, if people are collecting signatures, they want an issue to be voted on, that is their right, and I will certainly uphold that, and I will uphold Amendment 3 when it's passed.
If it doesn't pass, conversely, what would you do as an Attorney General? Because it's an existing law, and you have to defend the state laws.
That's a really good point. And I think, look, I mean, the Attorney General, in my view, you're bound by the laws that are passed. I mean, our current Attorney General doesn't seem to agree with that, but there's a separation of powers for a reason there. I think advocacy is still really important from that office. And look, we have such an extreme abortion ban in Missouri. We are putting people in danger. Even President Donald Trump disagrees with it. So I think it's something that certainly we need to revisit no matter what. But I feel very confident, given how many folks I've talked to, that Amendment 3 will be going into the state constitution.